Africa's Future on Exhibition. I'm Herman Lebovics. For some decades, the Conseil représentatif des associations noires de France, the CRAN, has championed the memory of, and through its one-time spokesman, Louis-Georges Ten, acted the collective organic intellectual for a movement of French people of African heritage to return to Africa pieces of the material patrimoine held in French museums. This is an engram that Google allows, and it shows the frequency of mention of the word restitution in French books over a period. Here's one around the time of the Congress of Vienna, when all the things that Napoleon stole over Europe reached this climax. Here's another one when Alsace-Lorraine was taken by the Prussian Germans. Here is the restoration of Alsace-Lorraine at the end of World War I. Restitution comes up at the moment of decolonization as an important word, and then the current one, which is still in process. Several African states have been demanding the same for some years. For at least three-quarters of a century, many of these pieces have represented to visitors the metropolitan museums the identity and the breadth of La Plus Grande France. Initially displayed mostly in the Musée de l'Homme, in 2006, they were removed to the new museum built on the Seine by Jacques Chirac, himself a collector of objects of colonial heritage. When Emmanuel Macron took office in 2017, of the estimated 90,000 African cultural items in state possession, about 70,000 of them had come to the Musée de Quai Branly Chirac. There, the aesthetically most prized items were installed in the darkened main exhibition space, handsomely hung or on pedestals. Those are Benin marbles in French possession. That's also from Benin. And those are funeral posts. And they were beautifully lit. Behind each piece and running the length of the Seine side of the building, visitors saw a floor-to-ceiling silkscreen of a dense jungle, suggesting in architect Jean Nouvel's primitivist vision their supposed African origins. They have a fire extinguisher in the jungle to save the wooden piece. A word on a specific ontological concern for such a restitution. To be sure, most African cultural objects are made of wood or other organic materials. They break, they rot, they become unusable. Usually another mask or statue or post is made and infused with the power of the no longer usable object. So why make a fuss over such things as, for example, old wooden grave markers? As a young Senegalese historian once teased me, quote, "It is you Westerners who are the fetishists, not we Africans." But as a kind of unspoken substantiation of the cultural power of the Western modernity that has been imposed on the colonies, the new nations of Africa want back the stolen treasures currently on display in French museums. Why? Well, theft is a crime in both the Western legal tradition as it is in many African societies. And thieves typically do not get to keep their booty. But also, some African states want to build their own museums and welcome tourists to be impressed by the example of the historic material culture they're in. And exercising soft power as policy wonks say in a land with poor economies, weak militaries, and currently little diplomatic influence. Such museums exist now in Senegal, for example. The museum of Black civilizations, paid for by the Chinese. There's the Chinese representative at the opening ceremony, and that's the entrance to the museum. Such museums exist now. Others are under construction or plan, such as the one in Benin City, Nigeria, which is short of funds and the opening date is not set. The objects wanting repatriation are not in the order of stolen silverware or automobile or public funds or even natural resources. In the words of a contemporary Egyptian writer, Yusuf Raka, quote, all through the first half of the 20th century, ancient Egypt is central to the nationalist Renaissance being prophesied or planned. The Senegalese economist Felwine Sarr, who now teaches in the United States, wishes to avoid applying the words development or underdevelopment to the lands of the African continent. He argues that the needs of African societies are not to, quote, catch up in the footsteps of the old post-World War II universal developmental model, as, for example, one diagram in 5 necessary stages by W.W. Rostow in 1960. This Rostow termed his scheme a non-communist manifesto. Economic development in the poor new nations of the then called Third World, it was hoped by Western Cold Warriors, would halt the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan, quote, saved Europe, as American policymakers like to put it. Ditto, hopefully, for Africa. So much for the scientific objectivity of economics. Rostow named the first universal stage traditional society. That phrase covered literally a lot of territory, and it faces diverse histories and important cultural differences. Sarr urges rather that African societies continue the process of decolonizing themselves, that is, dumping useless and time and place specific Western strictures and find their own cultural paths to vitalize and grow the human relationships of the society. He championed social inquiries and policies where the study of the economy is not separated from particular history, culture, and social life. For social scientists that he sees Africa as the great new place open to all sorts of experiments in all realms. But these cannot be random experiments. The changing society has first to center itself, to be able to make great moves and creative innovations, nor must it necessarily follow earlier Western models of modernity. As a first priority for such a reconstruction, he and art historian Benedict Savoy, his co-author of the historic report to newly elected Emmanuel Macron, recommended that any African cultural object currently in French state prisons, lacking overwhelming evidence of an honest provenance, must be considered as improperly removed from the land, but now nation, where it was made and had gotten its first meaning. And so must be earmarked for return home, a word that keeps cropping up in this restitution debate. As writers Ruth McLean and Alice Marshall put it, to Africans, the African treasures in Western hands, quote, the stolen works are not just physical objects of art, but narratives. Nigerian artist Onati Agbebo says, they were made to tell stories, to keep memories, and to hand over all these stories and memories from one generation to another. Western collectors and museums, he continued, quote, have turned these pieces into objects of admiration when these were objects holding information. Thus, sustained by the land's cultural icons, the renewal of cultural vitality is the condition for stability and change. French government is acting or intending to act both in reaction to this internal pressure and to launch new initiatives of French influence, but hopefully not the Gaullist France Afrique again in Africa. Speaking to a university audience in Burkina Faso soon after winning the presidential election in 2017, Emmanuel Macron expressed his agreement to the right of the peoples in Africa to regain these treasures of their past as fundaments for building their futures, for which he was warmly applauded. But also, in a discourse new to official fans, he emphasized how important it was for young people of the African diaspora in France to see their objects as part of a dual heritage, African and French, returned to the lands of their ancestors. Immediately on his return to Paris, the president created the Savoie Commission to report to him the why, the how, and the when of the restitution. This report by two independent scholars was to spell out the course of action Macron had only outlined. It too referred to both the cultural objects and the people of African heritage living in France as belonging to a diaspora. But then, nothing much happened. Yes, on November 18th, 2020, a ceremonial sword belonging to a Senegalese learned man and resistance leader, which had been confiscated in 1893 when a French punitive expedition had seized it and a number of other objects, was ceremoniously returned. That the day before, Senegal had agreed to buy 3 French-made missile-equipped patrol vessels takes away a little bit of the aura of altruism from the restitution of the sword. The books seized by French troops at the same time as the sword were not given back, nor is there a current plan for this return. But then history accelerated. On June 12th, 2020, a little over a year ago, 5 men entered the Musée du Quai Chirac, intent on reclaiming and bringing home, as their spokesman put it, one of several African funereal posts on permanent display there. Kinshasa-born Mawazulu Diabanza, militant campaigner for restoring African heritage, had come to perform guerrilla restitution. With 4 associates, all wearing black berets, one filming with a smartphone, he tore an African funeral post from its plinth and began walking out of the museum with it. As he walked, he paused several times, holding the post to pronounce a largely accurate litany on the crimes of French colonialism and of the European shameless theft of pieces of the African heritage. The trailing curators and staff members could not dissuade him to peaceably give up his treasure. In desperation, they called them the Paris police. When the Abanza saw the uniformed policeman, he welcomed them with, quote, "Ah, the police are here. Officer, I want to report a theft." The judge sentenced him to a fine of 250 euros and 2 months in prison, suspended. And unlike the Rheingold at the end of the ring cycle, the post was returned to its old, if not rightful place in the museum. These cultural objects, if and when finally repatriated, will serve as a site of memory for further construction of modern French society, as they had for the French people of the imperial last 3 French republics. The debate continues. We have seen here the workings of Frederick Jameson's idea of cultural objects being, quote, wrapped in layers of meaning as they move from hand to hand and place to place. This continues to be a complex and moving in all sense process of recovering their histories for many peoples and the cultural objects which are markers of these histories. They represent their ongoing process to create their decolonial cultural memories. And as students of life in France, it will also be fascinating to follow what repatriation means for the ongoing reconsideration of French society's sense of self. Thank you.